And welcome everyone. I'm Jude Ball, a researcher in the Aspire 2025 group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today, both those here in the audience and those beaming in via the internet. Thanks for coming. As you probably know, Pacific peoples in New Zealand have been saying forever, don't bunch us all in together. We are separate ethnicities with different languages, different cultures, different backgrounds, different health issues. So stop treating us as one homogenous group. So it's really exciting to present this seminar today, which does not lump Pasifika together, but looks at Samoan, Tongan, Niuean and Cook Island adolescent smoking separately. This study came about when Richard, Edwards, Dalice and I were doing another project, also using the ASH Year 10 dataset. And our advisory group for that project, which included Stephanie Eric, who was the director of ASH at the time, and Dan Tautolo, Pacific researcher from AUT, that advisory group raised the idea of doing this specific Pacific ethnicity study, which we agreed was a great idea and had real potential for informing prevention efforts. So the advisory group suggested it. Dallas went away and got some funding from the Cancer Society locally, and here we are. So for those of you in the room, I don't think Dallas needs much introduction, but for those who don't know her, she is one of our wonderful biostatisticians who works across the whole School of Medicine, providing statistical advice for a whole range of studies. But for this particular study, Dallas is the principal investigator. So I will hand over to her.
Thanks, Jude, and thanks everyone for coming. So I think this is an interesting topic from a variety of standpoints, and as Jude said, it's not very often that we have enough Pasifika in our samples that we can split them into the specific ethnicities that we have. And so the ASH data are what provided us with the opportunity to do that. So, oops, my arrows aren't working.
Your arrows aren't working. Make your arrows work. Let's come back, click on that.
Okay. So from the ASH data, we have, everyone knows that the ASH data is an annual survey of Year 10 students throughout New Zealand. And when we look at the ASH data just by the broad ethnicity groups, we find that Māori and Pasifika, okay, let's see if I can get, there we go, I can see that. Okay, Māori and Pasifika, Māori being the top and Pasifika being the green one, the second line, have the highest rates. And the European and other have a lower rate, and the Asian have a very low rate. So what's happening is, of course, that all of these in the adolescent population, these are 14 to 15-year-olds, all of these smoking rates are decreasing over time. And it's a wonderful story because we don't want our adolescents smoking, and we hope that if they don't smoke when they're adolescents, they're not going to take it up later. But that's a question for another time. The difficulty is that the Māori and the Pasifika have started so high that even though they're zooming down at a terrific rate of knots, they're still higher than the European and the Asian. And so when you get down here, the difficulty is that of the smokers, a higher percentage of them are actually Māori or Pacific. And that's not right. I mean, we would like Māori and Pacific to have an equal opportunity at wellness, i.e. to not be smokers. And so we're very interested because all of the research has, as usual, been focused upon, I shouldn't say all, I have been accused of overreaching sometimes, but a lot of the research has been focused on the Europeans and finding risk factors for the majority of adolescents, and the minority adolescent groups have not had a specific focus to them. So the risk factors we talk about are risk factors that were established in most of that majority group. So the question is, are they relevant for Pacific and Māori? I'm not going to talk about Māori today. And are they equally relevant for all the different groups of Pacific adolescents that live in New Zealand? So this is just overall for Pacific. This is from the New Zealand Health Survey. These are the adults greater than 15. So you can see amongst Pacifica, adult smoking is really not doing very much. And the Pacifica smoking from the ASH survey is decreasing. So, you know, the kids have it over the adults. They understand. But so the same pattern is happening in the Pacifica overall as we've seen before. So what the ASH survey allowed us to do is to have a very large sample size of information by 4 Pacifica ethnicities: Samoan, Tongan, Niuean, and Cook Island Māori. There was also an other Pacific thing. We're not going to talk much about the other Pacific because, as we know, there's a lot of other Pacific islands and they have a variety of different cultures. So first of all, so we didn't see how, if the other Pacific group was doing something different, we could talk really about what was going on, because it could have been a mix of different things happening in different places. So we kind of put them to one side. And our comparator group are the non-Māori, non-Pacific. So our total sample sizes are very high, and especially and in this last group where we concentrate on the latest years that we have data for, we have, you know, almost 65,000 observations, which most statisticians would be happy with. So our aims were to ask the question about both adolescent smoking per se, in other words, the prevalence of adolescent smoking, and there we were going to concentrate on 2013 to 2015, and also the trends over time, and look at them separately by Samoan, Tongan, Cook Island, Māori, and Niuean adolescents. And these are all living in New Zealand, right? So they're a mix. Some of them might be new immigrants, some of them might be first generation, second generation, third generation New Zealanders. So it could be a mix. Well, it is a mix. And then we know we have some risk factors that we've established, as I say, using other results from that and what's in the literature. And are these changes over time, or I knew I was going to missay that. Are the differences between the ethnic groups explained by a differential exposure to known risk factors? Or are there other different risk factors that might be relevant for, say, Samoans, but not for Tongans, or some such thing? And then what are the most important modifiable risk factors? Where should we go to reduce the burden of smoking in adolescents, Pacifica adolescents? So for methods, as Jude said, we got our funding from the Cancer Society, the local branch here, very helpful. And we got our data, thanks to the ASH group, from their survey and we were looking in this case for 2004 to 2015. And we grouped them into 3-year groups. That's because, just to make sure we had enough sample size, we're looking at subgroups and so on. So the outcome that we were interested in was regular smoking, and regular smoking means smoking at least monthly, so monthly or weekly or daily. So that's what we've been looking at for a lot of our things. We got the data in a prioritized format. Basically, we know that there's more Samoans than other ethnicities. And so what we do, we prioritize the specific ethnicities that are smaller. So if you multiple Pacifica ethnicities and you put down Niuean, then you're in the Niuean. If you don't put down Niuean, then the next question is, are you a Cook Island Māori? And if you do, then you're a Cook Island Māori. And so even if you're a Niuean and a Samoan, you'll be a Niuean, etc. So that prioritization is something that helps us sample size-wise, but there's no real other justification for it. And as a comparator, we discussed with our advisory group, and they suggested we look at non-Māori and non-Pacific. So those are the Europeans, the others, and the Asians. The risk factors we had access to was parental smoking, older sibling smoking, best friend smoking, and then two secondhand smoking variables, past week exposure to smoking in the home and past week exposure to smoking in cars, which I understand the new government is again being interested in, so yahoo. And we have some demographics that we're going to use as our baseline demographics: age, which is either 14 or 15, sex, school decile, and of course ethnicity comes into everywhere. So the first thing we established was to do a simple model and ask is there a difference in smoking rates between Samoan, Tongan, Niuean, and Cook Island. Now the non-Māori, non-Pacific, oh gosh, it's over. Let me have a look. Oh, see, I can find it if I look over here. Our reference is the non-Māori, non-Pacific, so if they have an odds ratio of 1 and the Samoans have an odds ratio of 1.59 or about 1.6, then that says to, just by virtue of being Samoan, they have a 60% higher smoking rate than regular smoking rate than non-Māori, non-Pacific. So the Samoans increased smoking by about 60%. The Tongans are about twice as high. The Niueans about 3 times as high, and the Cook Island Māori about 4 times as high. And this is adjusting for school decile age and sex. So yes, we have differences, and I think it's a big difference between a 60% increase and a 4-fold increase in smoking. But we know that the risk factors that we look at all have different prevalences in the different ethnicities. In other words, how the different ethnic groups are exposed to the risk factors in different ways. So here's our risk factors that talking about the people around them that smoke: the mother, the father, both parents, older siblings, and best friends. And so the pale blue are the non-Māori, non-Pacific. So that's our reference. And the other blue on the other side is actually the Cook Island Māori. And they tend to have the highest rate of exposure of all of these. Okay, so there's a consistency of that. But all of the groups appear to have an increased exposure to all of these rather than the non-Māori, non-Pacific. Okay. So we would expect, by virtue of that exposure, that they would have higher smoking rates. And so we're going to investigate whether that's the cause or the statistical cause or the explanation of the higher smoking rates. The other ones that we're interested in is secondhand smoking, and this is really quite interesting for us because of the ability to modify it. So if we just look at the 2 total columns here for a moment, the total column for smoking in the home, again, non-Māori, non-Pacific is around 20%, but the Cook Island Māori about 50-something%. And here for smoking in vehicles, the non-Māori, non-Pacific are sort of 12-13%, whereas the Cook Island Māori are over 30%. So again, the Pacific ethnicities have higher exposure in general, but not only that, some Pacific ethnicities have exposure that's really extremely different, quite a bit higher than the non-Māori, non-Pacific. And amongst these groups, you can see that, where's the Samoans? The Samoans are the purple ones, and usually the Samoans are the closest to the non-Māori, non-Pacific in terms of their exposure. So the other part of this is, what is the effect of having that exposure? And does that differ by Pacific ethnicity? In other words, does it matter if you're a Samoan? Does it having a best friend smoking, does that double your chance of smoking? whereas perhaps if you're a Cook Island Maori, it might triple it. Okay, so what we did was we looked at our odds ratios. So odds ratio is basically a multiplier of the odds of being a smoker, being a regular smoker. And here my eyes are getting me confused because I've got the wrong glasses. We had this conversation before. Anyway, so what we find if we look, where are we? Where is it? Ooh, there he is. Okay, I can look up here. That'll be better. So if we look at non-Māori, non-Pacific, amongst non-Māori, non-Pacific, the biggie is best friend smoke. Okay, and so this means if your best friend smokes, you have an 18-fold chance, higher chance of smoking yourself. It's huge. And then the next one, which is way down but still significant, is smoking in the home. If your parents allow smoking in the home, then you have double the chance of being a smoker. But if we look along here, okay, so point number one, best friend smoke isn't a very helpful thing, okay? Because if we're talking about population interventions, telling your best friend not to smoke is the same as telling you not to smoke. I mean, you're in the same population. So most of these best friends will be adolescents of about the same years. So basically, it's not a very helpful modifiable risk factor. Oh, sorry, I forgot about sibling smoke. Siblings are also more important down here than the others. But for the Pasifika, best friend smoking, the odds ratio is considerably reduced. Right? It's still big, still having an effect, but doesn't have nearly the effect if you're a European. And sibling smoke, which has a good size effect if you're a European, non-Māori, non-Pacific, these little stars mean it's not significant. Contrary to the usual way of presenting data, what we're doing here is putting stars when the odds ratio is not significant. So sibling smoke is not significant at all, has minimal effect, if any effect, on smoking rates in Pacifica. Okay. Both parent smoke is up and down. Secondhand smoke is relatively high, or at least about the same amount as the European, the non-Māori, non-Pacific. So smoking in the home still has a sizable effect, although again, there's some variation here. Smoking in cars in non-Māori, non-Pacific doesn't quite double it, but we see here amongst the Niueans, smoking in cars if you're exposed to smoking in cars on the last week, you're about 3 times more likely to be a smoker. So, these things, there's a different pattern of odds ratios from the non-Māori, non-Pacific, and there are different patterns within the different ethnicities. Okay. So how do we pull all that together? We do something called a population attributable risk, which takes into account how many people are exposed in the population and what is the effect. So, for example, you could have an odds ratio that's 4. So if you have the risk factor, you're 4 times more likely to be a smoker. But if only 1% of the population has that risk factor, then that's not going to have much of an effect on the population rate of smoking. Okay? So the PAR gives us some estimate, and it's, I probably shouldn't say, it's sort of a best guesstimate, a bunch of people sitting around a table with liquid refreshment trying to figure out how to put these 2 pieces of information together. So what I've done here is, because I like colours, is I have put in purple the highest population attributable risk across the ethnicities, and red is the second highest. Okay? So I see 2 distinct patterns here. For 4 out of the 5, the non-Māori, non-Pacific, and everybody except the Niuean, best friend smokes is the most powerful. It explains most of the attributable risk. Okay, it's about the same in 3 of the 4. This one's a bit lower maybe, but it's not as high for Niuean. And the second one, the second most effect, is smoking in the home, which has a way higher effect for all 4 Pasifika ethnicities than it does for non-Māori. So smoking in the home is a much stronger risk factor. It has much higher effect on population smoking rates. Sorry, I'm not looking at my watch. And basically, once you've got the 2 coloured ones, the other ones in terms of non-Māori, non-Pacific kind of just bottom out, don't they? There's nothing very exciting there. But Niuean have about 3 different risk factors. Best friend smoking, okay. Smoking in cars, and then smoking in home is the third one. And that's up at 32%. So for the Niueans, there are 3 different risk factors that are contributing in a high percentage to their smoking rate. And that's something that as public health people, we can actually use to suggest things that might work that would reduce the smoking rate. Okay. So Niueans are a bit different, is the key thing here. Cook Island Māori also seem to be a bit different. So what we did was, what did we do next? This is, these are the odds ratios we talked about before. These are the ones with adjusting just for age, sex, and decile. And this, so 60%, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. If we put in all of the risk factors that are in that table and see how much the odds ratio for the difference by ethnicity, you can see all of these are a lot closer to 1. So when we control for all of the risk factors that we know about, and there's others risk factors out there, these are just some basic ones that we know about and which were recorded in the survey, then 3 out of the 4 groups, specific groups, have a non-statistical, there's no statistical difference between them and non-Māori, non-Pacific. So for those groups at least, and perhaps for Cook Island Māori, depending upon what's going on, for those groups at least, we could say that the risk factors that we've found for the main group of people actually would work for the Pacific. So we're quite happy about that, because we don't have to go out and find something different, although we could sort of ask about something different. This one here, the Cook Island Māori, is still significantly greater than 1. So the Cook Island Māori still have a higher rate of smoking than non-Māori, non-Pacific, even when we control for all the risk factors. So we were quite excited about that, because it's nice to know that there's nothing intrinsically about a specific ethnicity that causes them to smoke that we can't measure. So this is the same information. You can see that the blobs, the filled-in blobs, are the partially adjusted, so just age, sex, and decile. And you can see the odds ratio for non-Māori, non-Pacific, and then Samoan 1.6, and then Tongan getting up to 2, and 3, and 4. So you can see them going up. But when we adjust for all of the risk factors, they pretty much all stay along a straight line, except the Cook Island Māori are a bit higher. So the next thing we have to ask about, how much time do I have? As much as I want? 5 or 6 minutes, okay. Next thing we wanted to talk about is to talk about the trajectory of smoking decline, and to ask whether that's different by ethnicity, or are they all going down at the same rate? And those are the plots over time, and there's some differences. They're not all exactly parallel. In fact, Niueans had the highest decline rate over the time period. Okay, so they were pretty high to start with, but they're really zooming down. So they're declining about 23% over this period. Tongans 21%, Cook Island Māori, and so on, and non-Māori, non-Pacific 9.6%. So that's the kind of rate that we're comparing them to. So they're all reducing at a higher rate than non-Māori, non-Pacific. So the communities are doing a good job in terms of reducing the smoking in their adolescents. And the rate of decline is highest in Niuean and lowest in Samoan and Cook Island Māori. Samoans, to me, just, I don't know, it just seemed to be more like the non-Māori, non-Pacific than the other groups. They, of course, are the largest, and I don't know too much about being just a Palangi. I'm not too sure about all of the cultural history, but I think there's a greater mix there of new immigrants, first, second, third generations, and so on. So for them to be the one that's closest to non-Māori, non-Pacific is not unusual, I wouldn't say. The disappointing thing is that the Cook Island Māori have a low rate of decline, and they're the ones that are highest. So they're the ones that really need to hurry up, if you like. In fact, our data ends in 2015, and in fact, this is still continued for the Niueans and even for the Cook Island Māori, but not so much for the Tongan and Samoan. These are probably not statistically significant because of the numbers, but so don't read too much into that, but it seems to be continuing. So the good news is that adolescent smoking has declined greatly in all Pasifika ethnicities since 2004. And we presented this stuff to a group of Pasifika health advocates, frontline workers up in Auckland, and they were very excited about that. They had never heard of that before, and they thought that that was something they could tell their clients that they should be proud of. And so that felt good. Something is going very right in the Niuean community. And we asked the Pasifika people, I said, you know, you're a frontline, you see these people all the time. What are the Niueans doing right? And they had a few suggestions, but, you know, be nice if we could get some suggestions from other people as well, because what we can find is happening correctly or doing a good job in the Niuean community, perhaps we could move that to the other communities as well. And secondly, secondhand smoking exposure, especially in cars, is a biggie in terms of population attributable risk for these adolescents. So we would want to, we're talking about in the home and in cars, and we'd like to reduce those disparities. And the interesting thing is that it's even, once we put in the exposure to secondhand smoke into the model, the effect of parental smoking disappears. So that doesn't mean that parental smoking isn't having an effect, because of course the two of them are highly related. But it does encourage us that perhaps we could say to parents, we know it's hard to quit, you're addicted to nicotine, you know, so it's very hard for you to quit. But if you could smoke outside, and if you could not smoke in your car, then there's a chance that we may be able to reduce the smoking rate in your children. The bad news is that smoking in Cook Island Māori adolescents remains very high. And it is going down, but not fast enough. And the secondhand smoking, which is what I just talked about. So directions for future research, there's always more to be done. Disappointing that we weren't able to get any ideas about what was happening in smaller Pasifika groups. That would be good to know. If we want to pay more attention to secondhand smoke, smoke-free homes and cars, something's going right in the Niuean communities. And why is it so high in the Cook Island Māori? And I don't know if the downward trend is plateaued or reversed. I don't think statistically we can say that yet, but it doesn't seem to be still going down as fast, and maybe that's something that we could investigate further. And so thank you very much.
Any questions for Dalice?
Oh, yes, Lucy.
I need someone to run the mic, please. Any volunteers? James. But I've come halfway. So for the other people, I'm Lucy Telfer Barnard from the department here. I just wanted to really great and really interesting presentation, Dalice. So I just wanted to push back on that question of whether best friend smoking is a modifiable risk factor. You know, I could envisage some sort of quit smoking program which encouraged friends to quit together or something in that space. So I think, you know, any of those things we can kind of learn from rather than say, okay, we can't do anything about that. What else is there?
Yeah, and I've been saying that in our little meetings, but I don't get much response from these two because I think they've gone through the discussion before, and in terms of population health, there's a sense that that has been tried and doesn't work. So yeah, you need to take the microphone, Richard.
I think there's two things to one. I think it's a legitimate risk factor at the individual level, but it's probably not a legitimate risk factor to look at the population level, because if you're trying to explain those changes by best friend smoking changes, well, what's changing best friend smoking? They're coming from the same population, but at the individual level, I think it probably is a fair enough risk factor. And actually, Lucy, there are some interventions, that peer-led interventions and that have used that sort of approach. So it is tried. The general problem is, I think, with school-based interventions they're not very effective in this particular area unless they're extremely well resourced, and you then get into questions of sustainability and things like that. So well, a lot of people would say that it's actually better to look at the more population-based policy type measures rather than expending lots of resources on school-based intensive interventions. They're probably not the most cost-effective way to go. But yeah, but it has been tried.
Thank you, Dalice, for a Palangi statistician. That was very excellent.
Now, I'm not very sure, Ramona, whether you're emphasising the Palangi or the statistician.
Both. So that was excellent. I just wanted to ask you about the Cook Island Māori and Niuean rates, because yeah, that's probably the biggest thing, and perhaps Richard and Jude, you could also explain why you think that population, those two particular population groups are, you know, and the irony of it, and I have to say this, is that of course Niue and Cook Islands are, you know, friendly territories of Aotearoa, as we all know, and yet they have the worst health stats. So this has been part of the political debate, and I think, you know, we all know Kiki Moate, pediatrician, he was Associate Dean Pacific for Otago in Christchurch, has always argued that if there has to be, you know, a regional approach to this, it should be in either Cook Islands or Niue and not Fiji, where the medical school is. So, you know, that's part of the bigger debate. But yeah, I'd be interested to know what the Pacific Advisory Group in particular have said to explain this, because these two populations have been in Aotearoa for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. The travel between the two countries is continuous. Mm-hmm. And of course, we have more Niueans here in Aotearoa than in Niue. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole lot of factors like that in terms of the migratory patterns. I know Diane sitting next to me, she might contribute to this too. Oh, are you going to answer that, please?
Well, I don't have an answer, but when we presented it up in Auckland, there was a suggestion, and I have no idea of the veracity of this, but there was a suggestion from the Pasifika workers that the Cook Island community might be less cohesive in New Zealand. And the other suggestion that they had was that Niueans, Stephanie Eric, who worked with us to start with and moved on, but she's a Niuean, and she is so adamant about non-smoking. And so the sort of the answers we were getting, that was the best guess, and this was only a best guess, was that what the communities needed was someone to spearhead the campaign against smoking and make it clear how important it is, and that if the community was cohesive enough, that message would get out. But that was, I don't know if that's right or not. And Ramona, you look like you disagree with me, so tell me something different.
Yeah, I disagree on that completely. I think, you know, there are levels of cohesion right across the Pacific communities.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not the session to go into that, but one of the other factors which hasn't been shown here is the intermarriage of Cook Island Māori. There's very high numbers of Cook Island intermarrying with Māori, and Niuean and Māori in particular in Auckland, which is really rarely captured in data. So that would be quite interesting because, you know, of that very close connection of Niue and Māori and Cook Island Māori. But I mean, Stephanie's done some great work. The thing also is that it's not reflected is in terms of the health promotion work is the addiction smoking campaign health work that has happened over the last decade. It's been particularly strong, and it's changed obviously with the funding changes in the last few years. So it might be reflected in that. So it'd be quite interesting to see what happens in the next decade. But thank you.
Well, any suggestions you might have?
Questions from our online participants? Right. Any other questions in the room?
So just based on something that Ramona said, it made me wonder, did you do any sensitivity analysis looking at the hierarchy of ethnicity to find out if multiple racial identities contributed any differences in outcomes?
We weren't able to do that. The data came hierarchical, unfortunately. And we did have the other ethnicities, the adolescents were asked to write in their other ethnicities. We didn't get that data either. So we were kind of stuck with what we had, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I think we can bring the session to a close, but please join with me in thanking Dalice for a really fascinating presentation.
Okay, we'll stop this.